That's what I'm talking about.
Wait! Okay, now, from the beginning.
Hit it, boys.
Welcome to Control Plus Create, AI for Creatives, a special 5-part pulse check mini-series from Enrollify and Element 451. I'm Dave Hunt, Executive Creative Director and longtime higher ed marketer. In this series, I'm sitting down with leaders and creative leads who are partnering with AI to scale ideas, streamline workflows, and push their work further without losing their voice. You'll get behind-the-scenes stories and practical playbooks to help you turn AI into your newest collaborator, not your competition. Whether you're leading strategy or hands-on in the work, our goal is to give you the tools and inspiration to unlock new possibilities with AI. Let's dive in. My guest today is Maya Georgieva. As the founding senior director of the Innovation Center and the XR, AI, and Quantum Labs at Parsons School of Design and the New School, Maya leads a multidisciplinary team driving transformation in spatial computing, generative AI, quantum computing, and digital strategy. She teaches the signature Immersive Storytelling course at Parsons, engaging over 100 emerging artists in creative applications of AI, XR, and frontier tech. Maya has presented at the United Nations, UNESCO, and other leading forums. Her insights on AI, digital transformation, immersive storytelling, and ethics in technology have been featured in The Economist, The Atlantic, The Chronicle of Higher Education, and more. She's also collaborated with IBM, Google, HP, and Meta to develop partnerships that bridge research, education, technology, and industry to prepare institutions for the future of digital engagement. Maya, welcome to the show.
Hello, Dave. I'm excited to be here.
I'm so excited to talk to you, Maya. I have to tell you, when I was prepping for the show, I felt like there were so many directions we could take this conversation. I ended up with probably 36 questions that came to mind. So you're doing so many cool and interesting things. And so I did my best to narrow our focus down to what will probably be a good single episode, because I feel like we could do a whole series just on all the stuff that you're doing.
Yeah, your questions were excellent. I actually thought that for a moment, just in our pre-conversation, we could definitely run one of, we're like at this point in such deep waters with so many of these developments that the conversations can get deeper as we start.
I thought we could start by defining a term that I don't think I had heard before until I saw it on your LinkedIn profile. So you describe yourself as a narrative futurist. What does that role mean to you, and how does it shape the way you work with AI and emerging technologies?
Yes, so right. Being a narrative futurist means imagining and building futures through the lens of storytelling, which is how I entered the space. I'm always scanning the world for signals and patterns. This is my futurist hat, social, technology, cultural shifts. And then I use storytelling as a primary lens for making sense of these possibilities. So it's just not about seeing individual trends, but being able to take them and create a narrative around them, which really describes this new reality in a way that others can see their larger impact. It's about using narrative not just to reflect on the world, but the prototype, possible worlds. I work with AI, XR, and quantum systems, not simply as tools and technologies, but as the new terrains of storytelling, deeply influenced by this narrative mindset. That is my approach, and is also driven by this idea that I'm fascinated by all kinds of new forms of language and expression. Very early in my childhood, I was like really drawing images and writing, and from that point, and writing essays, and I really developed this kind of practice, which is also today a joy of iterative process. Revising that image, revising text, concepts over hundreds times over, and kind of almost like really getting good in and like really zeroing in, and that continues to help me today to engage in and early with these technologies that discover these kind of more complexity and seeing to their potential and mostly like in my space is inspiring others. So I think that's really the way I approach this. It's it's both powered by intuition and strategy. How I engage with technologies, not just as a finished product, but really much more as an evolving conversation. So being a narrative futurist means inhabiting these different worlds and Sometimes I describe them as really inhabiting thresholds between disciplines, between the known and the speculative, the today and the future. And quantum computing has also helped me in that and describe my practice as being in two states at once, much like quantum bits are, being in a state of 0 and 1. So
Right.
that's one way I approach this whole space as a emerging ecosystem. Um, but yeah, at the core of my practice is curiosity about culture and language and ways of expression, and immersing myself in diverse perspectives allows me to approach emerging technologies not as a way of being as fear or even resistant, but as a kind of openness to make
Yeah.
sense and create in this chaos. Because story moves us forward and gives us an opportunity to create the future we want to inhabit. That is one of the ways I see the world, and
Yeah.
particularly like this future reality.
I love that you talked about the exhilaration of, this new technology, and then sharing that with your students and inspiring that. Your work blends spatial storytelling and generative systems and quantitative thinking. What should creative professionals understand first about these things that can feel like entirely new paradigms?
Creative professionals need to understand that we have new affordances presented by these
Mm,
technologies that fundamentally shift how we approach storytelling, problem solving, ways of knowing, understanding the world around us, engaging with the world around us. Spatial storytelling, for example, emphasizes world building, presence, agency, embodiment, the sensory immersion. And it really, it's not so much about the new technology that creates that possible. These are the affordances, but really thinking through these new opportunities. So it invites creators to design experiences, not just linear narratives, but encourage audiences to actively engage with them. So it's much more like a discovery process
mhm,
rather than passively consuming stories, although they're
mm,
not exclusive, and sometimes it is really the interplay is where things start to be really interesting. But in spatial storytelling, when we engage virtual, augmented, mixed reality, you're not designing to what is about to happen, or you're not just designing in that very close construct of beginning, middle, and end, but really where and how things unfold. And I think that's an opportunity that technology particularly is making possible. Generative system have also introduced a great deal of personalization, and this opportunity to not only be real time, which is now happening,
mhm,
but also driven by own personal data or by data. So that makes things very dynamic and responsive, meaning that our stories are constantly can reshape themselves according to our interaction and context and
mm,
our personal way of interacting with them, or maybe background or interest. So creatives can think of these generative tools in that context as collaborative partners. Quantum thinking, on the other hand, brings us in this space of interdeterminacy and
mhm,
complexity. And it is new to us and it is counterintuitive. But when we bring quantum, outcomes are not always predictable or binary in the same way. So it really invites us to embrace this thinking, and in sometimes we today, since quantum computing is still not as precise and still a work in progress, they create a lot of noise,
mhm.
meaning that we don't have a single answer sometimes, and we have these kind of multiple possibilities,
Yeah.
which then is also invites us to embrace noise, uncertainty, the interconnectedness of possibilities.
Mhm,
So I think that for creative professionals, and when I brought quantum computing first in our partnership with IBM at Parsons School of Design, I think a lot of people question it, like how is this happening? Like bringing this to creatives rather than say computer scientists. But creative professionals have just this extraordinary capacity that I recognize in my students every day to translate these abstract concepts into accessible metaphors. And sometimes even like tangible, like sometimes experiences that you can embody. That is a unique opportunity to enter space, which, as I mentioned, like quantum computing is very counterintuitive. It's not,
Yeah.
it takes us some time. It takes, as I say, multiple aha moments. I often say that to my students as well. So, our role as creatives and their opportunity as creatives is to explore these new affordances, leverage these unique capabilities, and in terms of both the artistic practice, creativity, and as well to as new forms of representations or as a
Hmm.
new form to address challenges, some of the complex challenges we see in the world.
One of the things that really fascinates me about your work is that you're using these frontier and emerging technologies in service of storytelling, which is something that's so foundationally and profoundly human. So, in the midst of using all of this exciting and dazzling and sometimes confusing technology, how do you keep the human creative voice front and center in all of that?
That's the heart of it, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, I always say technology does not tell stories, people do. So, keeping the human voice central is fundamental about intention. No matter how dazzling or cutting edge the technology, I always ask myself, how does this shape or change the human experience?
Hmm.
And in my work, um, the question kind of shapes in how what human experiences I'm trying to explain or amplify. What emotions,
Hmm.
questions, connections do I see that this can illuminate or spark? So technology is simply a vehicle, never the destination itself. And asking some of the hard questions: is this enhancing human connection, empathy, or understanding? Or is this about efficiency and meeting
Hmm.
operational goals?
Yeah.
Which technology can do, right? It can take us from point A to point B. And what does it accelerate? If the technology doesn't amplify human emotion or creativity, then we've lost sight of our goal. Ultimately, the human creative voice thrives when we intentionally align technology with our values or our
Hmm.
vision. And storytelling, in its most authentic form, always returns to human experience.
If a listener wants to dip a toe into immersive storytelling, and they maybe haven't thought of storytelling that way before, and they don't necessarily have a budget or access to your labs, what's an exercise that you'd assign to spark moving into more of that world building mindset that you talk about?
I would encourage starting with your immediate surroundings, your
Mm.
favorite activity, your neighborhood, home, even something from your daily commute, and reimagine that familiar space as an entirely new world.
Mm.
Map out this new world, not just visibly, but emotionally, and even more so sensory. In terms of the sensory experience, ask yourself um, what are the emotions that the space conveys, or the different parts of this walk or your commute conveys, and what hidden rules governs it, what hidden rules that we make, or the society or the world around us place or exist, what characters belong there. I'm always reminded of my own experiences with that, and I wasn't even 10 when I created and drew for my parents my first immersive concept of
Oh,
a
cool.
spatial virtual piano,
Oh,
and all the things that I can dream up in my mind's eye at that time. But it was this
yeah.
idea of a spatial piano, particularly. Of course, I played the piano. Then I was kind of really not so interested. Somebody else in my family, in different parts of the family, was interested, so we moved the piano out of home. Of course, at that point, as a 10-year-old, I was very interested. And so I came with this idea of a spatial piano, which is
Yeah.
always like addressing, it's really like in terms of design process, I'm always kind of fascinated how children, as children, we have this kind of unique way to play with ideas,
Yes.
and they come to us in our sort of iterative play. And so my first idea was really about this. I often share that experience, that concept of a spatial virtual piano that I had. And then fast forward 20 years later, it became a reality. And I even have kind of the privilege to teach immersive storytelling, which is really why it's fascinating.
Yeah. That's so
But
cool.
to think about sort of how do you engage with that exploration, it's also very, I think, helpful to deepen some sort of this exploration, meaning, try and immerse yourself in accessible other sources like
Mm.
free, and sometimes they're online exhibition in the virtual space, sometimes local sort of museums offer interactive exhibitions, games. There are even various low cost or no cost, depending on what access you have, AR apps that
Mm.
augmented reality apps that um, one can download and kind of start with a mobile experiences on the browser to play with. So, because the key is to experiment actively, borrowing these ideas from the space you are in, as well as from various fields, thinking in a more spatial way, oftentimes mean thinking about fields as architecture, art, narrative, design, performance, education. So inherently immersive storytelling is about all these kind of different genres coming together in a very cross-disciplinary way, blending oftentimes visual, sound, interactivity, physical environments, and digital assets. So I think the most important step is to simply to begin. Practice creating kind of small, sensory rich narratives within the space you already inhabit, and then see where that takes in terms of what a more richer experience could be in the context of immersive storytelling.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's really interesting to think about all those things coming together, and just like kind of that shift in mindset. I'd like to switch gears to talk about some of the tensions around working with these new technologies. And I know that you've done some thought leadership on in these areas too, on ethics and kind of a broad range of things. But to start, I'm curious about your thoughts on authorship. When we're using AI tools, do we start thinking about sharing credit with our quote unquote non-human collaborators, or how do we address authorship in this AI era?
It's an incredibly important and critical question today. And authorship and ownership have always been fluid concepts if we think about in more historical reference. And they've been shaped and reshaped by the creative technology of our time. But if we track back, all stories or start in the very oral tradition. So there was never a single author, and they were passed
Mm.
from a generation to generation. So, and then really with the invention of the printing press, the author emerged as a singular sort of voice
Yeah.
tied to a reproducible artifact, books. Eventually, we move into photographs, movies, and eventually this idea of copyright, which we have a different understanding to get today. But if we think about photography and film, introduce new tensions around this mechanical reproduction, and around this idea of a collective ownership. So then comes this idea of our digital age, where we not only like have the opportunity to be all creators, we're all
Right.
creators, but also remix
Mm.
culture, memes, fan fiction. Sort of, we have open source platforms which um, change our understanding of traditional sort of distribution norms. So all this together is a play in this idea of ownership and authorship. Still, like I think what's very important to say, even in those when we those paradigms have emerged, we could usually trace a creative lineage. So we could usually understand, we know this is a remix, but we could reference the source. And that's changed.
Yeah.
And I think that's an important part where, particularly in the context of creatives, because generative AI alters that equation in a formal, in a way, in a far more opaque and foundational way. So these models aren't just tools. They're massive systems trained on millions of creative works that we know some of them were just simply scraped from the internet,
Hmm.
absorbed, like taken without consent. Um, of course, these outputs, which is really sampling that data, the the various combination of those inputs, and then we end up with a synthetic,
Hmm.
sort of a synthetic sample original.
Yeah.
Some may argue. So that's very different, unlike earlier technology, which extended the creative expression while preserving these attribution trails. Generative AI obscures the origin. It doesn't just remix. It, in a way, we can explain that memorizes and reconstitutes fragments of artistic work.
Yeah.
Frequently, this is done without a visible fingerprint. So this is not just a reproduction, is what I have started to refer to and computational simulation. And
Mhm.
yes, I often joke, only half joking, that if it sounds like the Borg in Star Trek, it is. Resistance is futile, but
Yes.
this is precisely we must reflect deeply right now before the boundaries between the original and the derivative kind of work collapse into
Yeah.
noise. And particularly that's very important to me because every day I get to work with emerging artists, and this kind of ambiguity is especially troubling for emerging artists,
Hmm.
independent creators whose creative identities may be completely swallowed into this opaque data sets without permission, recognition, or compensation. And indeed, young people today, young creators, emerging artists, are very aware of that. They aren't safe. Very majority of them are very savvy, have a very sound understanding of that. They see this kind of AI generated content we see today is strained on the spark of human imagination. But then it becomes invisible. And as I said, particularly in the context of not when you're early in your career. And
Yeah.
that raises these urgent ethical and legal questions about ownership, consent, and value. So these are conversations that we must have. And I don't think we have yet the answers. And I think we are searching for them in ways to define this new space. I believe that transparency and attributions are essentials. And I also, that's important. That's the kind of ethical mindset that I see myself as a creator and a teacher and, working and collaborating with others is important. So if we use AI generated elements, text, image, audio, video, we must clearly disclose how they were made. This doesn't diminish the human role, it honors the integrity of the creative
Hmm.
process. And so that's kind of the ethical mindset, and so that's the practice that I think we should embody as we enter this new era in which ownership is being rewritten, and how we respond now will define norms, frameworks, and possible protections in the future.
Hmm.
So just in the last few weeks, the U.S. Copyright Office they released a 100 plus pages report on AI and copyright. Um, of course, this is not legally binding, um, but it's going to have an impact on some of the lawsuits that are already, I think, 40 lawsuits that are involving generative platforms. It makes one point clear, that training AI on copyrighted content is copying,
Hmm.
even when output isn't perfect replica. The model internal weights, right? Internal weights may
Yeah.
contain these stylistic traces, compositional structures, aesthetic fingerprints of original creators. And that implicates not just for developers, designers, technologists, creative technologists, but downstream users, students, marketers, designers
Yeah. Yeah.
who may, unknowingly perpetuate this uncredited influences. So, what struck me most in this report, though, is the acknowledgement of market flooding, and that's
Mm.
or dilution as a legitimate harm, and that is even if AI output doesn't directly copy your work, it can still influence your livelihood by mimicking your style and mass, which then producing endless wall of value version that saturates the market, and hence that idea of market flooding. And and as I said, I've seen this anxiety play out, kind of play. I've seen this anxiety play out in my classrooms.
Yeah.
Design students who are deeply attuned to visual language are often unsettled when they see AI generated content,
Yeah.
and particularly content that mirrors their own aesthetics.
Hmm.
Meanwhile, business students may use AI imagery casually, unaware of its origins or implications. Um, and at the same time, design students may think that, kind of playing out with text is similarly not necessarily harmful. So it's very interesting how when we play at our strength, when this plays at our strength, we see it in very clearly, and then certain things that where perhaps it complements or it assists us, we kind of our ways of assessment switch. For me, this is literally as I work with different groups of students, and depending on their kind of background and skill set, and you kind of see that asymmetry in
Yes.
literacy. um, and I think it's a bit of a cultural blind spot at the moment that we get more comfortable with things that doesn't immediately threaten our work, and then recognize things that, as I mentioned, are not as immediately part of the usual kind of for business students being able to create generative art and just purely as an illustration. They don't assess the visual context of this art. It's just
Yeah.
an illustration. And yet, uh, right, we just talk about what that means for if you are on the other side of this equation. So we definitely, I think the path forward demands like a new model of author. We need to figure out this new model of authorship, one that acknowledges not just individual expression, but the collective knowledge embedded into the creative work. Particularly if we are serious about protecting human imaginations, we
Hmm.
must build new ethical frameworks that include consent, compensation, and some level of creative control. Um, and we also like on the other side, we must kind of imagine a future where we credit non-human collaborators, because we know that these systems will continue, algorithms will continue to evolve, and it will be meaningful if we can kind of actually clarify this and have a greater understanding of how those systems are also built and build upon really this human creative capital invested over years, because the authorship of the future is still ours to define.
You've talked about a bunch of different things in your generative AI series this spring, ethical things and AI literacy and lots of interesting topics. And I know one of them was environmental cost. And the environmental cost of large models is one of the hot recurring topics I also am frequently seeing. So I'm curious if your students um, push back on that, if they ask questions like, should we even be using these power hungry generative tools? Are they thinking about that? And if they're asking those kinds of questions, how do you respond to that?
They do. So this is probably one of the top three questions I receive from students. And I tell students this is precisely the right question to ask. The environmental impact of large generative models is a critical ethical concern, and addressing it starts with an informed and, at this time, nuanced perspective.
Hmm.
So it's very important to understand how these tools function, their carbon footprint, and their broader application is essential. And so I encourage students to consider that, and encourage students to be to get a more informed perspective on that. The many data centers that are built in the last years just to continue to enable sort of the developments in generative AI.
Hmm.
And so in that conversation, I also encourage students to consider alternatives, which is it's not always completely take stepping away from the space. And for me, as somebody who experiments, that experimentation is incredibly valuable in actually understanding what the potential are and what the limitations might be. But considering lighter weight models, local
Mm.
computation, being able to discern when do you need that assistant or a particular generative tool, and how does it align with the projects or your personal sustainable values, because sometimes that can be a very personal choice. The starting point is to be informed
Yeah.
and not just to categorically reject powerful generative tools, but to be able to thoughtfully assess when and how they should be used and being able to articulate that. Because, as I mentioned, this idea of ethical mindset means
Hmm.
that it's not simply knowing, it's bringing it into your practice today and into your future work and your future space. Part of the work in these generative AI series with students and faculty has been helping them move beyond the abstract, sort
Hmm.
of the abstracts of ethics, into a more measurable and informed space and practice. Um, so I want them to be able to evaluate a model, not just for output quality, but for carbon footprint. I want them to consider alternatives, you know, thinking about how they may use their own data, how they may use more efficient prompts, or even deciding not to use the tool at all. That's what we can do today. I do have students who, for whom they completely have stepped away,
Mm.
and they would like to see a more responsible, ethical innovation in the space alongside this creative and technical exploration. So I think it's
Yeah.
very important, and it's very important to be fluent in that.
I think it's important that those are part of the conversation that we're having, and those considerations are being openly addressed and not just pushed to the side and dismissed. Like they're obviously like an important part of all of this, right? There are lots of tools out there, but we also have seen that tools are shifting and changing a lot. So if you were assembling a creative AI survival kit that was focused on mindsets and literacies instead of tools, what would you put inside when it comes to mindsets?
I love these questions. It's
Okay.
I feel like it's such a Maya question because it emphasizes the core of my approach,
Yeah.
which is focusing on cultivating a mindset rather than fleeting tools. I think that at the top of my creative sort of AI survival kit would be curiosity,
Hmm.
because genuine curiosity fuels experimentation, discovery, and deeper learning. Without it, you know, creative work is stagnates.
Yeah.
Next, I would probably include ethical awareness, because, just as we spoke, navigating emerging technologies demand constant reflection on the broader implications. Ethical mindset ethics ensure we remain responsible and
Hmm.
empathetic creators, recognizing that our innovation profoundly shapes society. So I would also add system thinking, which help us see how individual technology are embedded in a larger ecosystem, social, economic, demographics, environmental. I think it's also very important to emphasize kind of searching for these meaningful questions, the ability to identify and engage with the questions that challenge existing assumptions and kind of the space we exist today.
Yeah.
And inspires novel approaches. And that means oftentimes means to kind of move away from just making things more efficient or making the trains run sort of run on time, but
Right.
looking fundamentally how we can transform that. That is also really looking start with a compelling question or a real world challenge, and then invite unexpected kind of outcomes, but also invite unexpected voices in the room,
Yeah.
because that innovation oftentimes happens when creative work happens at the edge of the comfort zones. So what I'll deliberately leave out
Uh-huh.
is focus on mere efficiency,
Yeah.
and any kind of tool worship, like this
Mm.
is the best thing we ever seen, or this is how we do things, or this is the best way to do things. So these are usually things that you want to leave behind. So I think that's a survival kit um, based solely on tools risk becoming quickly obsolete,
Yeah.
and instead cultivating adaptable, thoughtful mindset, open mindset prepares us to thrive across technological shifts and transformation. So I think that's going to be my creative AI survival kit, which is curiosity, ethical awareness, thinking, meaningful questions, searching for questions, um, and that are able to drive us forward, and then let go of just purely thinking as efficiency and operational efficiency, and also like that one tool can solve it all, or one technology can have like this magic silver bullet.
Yeah. I think that those are fantastic lessons for uh, individuals as well as for leaders, like, and then thinking about how to foster those mindsets on your teams and make sure that you're creating that environment where it feels like people can embrace thinking and working that way. So I co-sign with your toolkit. I think it's great, Maya. I'm wondering if you could kind of in closing give us what you're seeing as something that's giving you the most hope right now as you look toward the future of creative work and education in the age of AI.
My students, always, my students, without hesitations, my students give me the greatest hope. They're the makers, the storytellers, the that are shaping the future every day, and witnessing their enthusiasm, creativity, willingness to challenge existing norms, and sometimes their struggles. Um, they don't simply adopt technology; they question them, and sometimes they hack into them, which is what I try to inspire to reshape them. That's what making me optimistic about what lies ahead. I think philosophically, I I resonate deeply with Kierkegaard's idea: life is not a problem to be solved, but a reality to be experienced. So, in my own practice, this means remaining fully present and engaged with students and colleagues and the people around me, and embracing both uncertainty and possibility. It's inherent in our rapidly evolving technology landscape. For me, it's important to encourage these young people to be persistent, um, to to create sort of this level of resilience, which I think is very important, and a lot wise ahead. And kind of circling back to this idea as a narrative futurist, I also feel um, and try to share my practice with them, and because I do feel immense hope in our ability to exist in thresholds
Mm,
between present and future, known and unknown. And my role is to help students and the people I work with cross these thresholds with confidence, curiosity, and ethical mindset.
yeah.
We don't know precisely what the future holds, but and that is not the point. It's not the point to predict the future, but the depth of their creativity combined with commitment in ethics, in meaningful innovation, assures me that heading towards kind of this future can lead genuinely inspiring possibilities. So, yeah, as I exist in multiple spaces, and I think that, yeah, I feel at times like a quantum traveler, moving between cultures and languages and identities, and I ask my students to do the same, to
Yeah.
hold space for that uncertainty, to continue to cultivate imagination as a practice, and to create their kind of to carry on their creative vision, both with urgency and care. And I think that's where the real hope kind of lives, in our collective willingness to imagine and build a better future.
I love that. And I've loved our conversation today. I really appreciate your time, Maya. If listeners would like to learn more about you and your work, how can they connect with you?
LinkedIn is one very quick way, just as we
Hmm.
connected. And sometimes, as a follow up on conversations that exist, I'm in New York City. I invite you to come visit, also visit me at the New School and Parsons School of Design and visit our labs. So you can also directly reach out to me. And I have the very perfect and quick way to do so, Maya at newschool.edu. We love visitors, and I love engaging with people in different perspectives.
That's awesome. Well, that's a wrap for this episode of Control Plus Create. Big thanks again to Maya for sharing deep insights on innovation, storytelling, ethics, and how we keep our human voice central in the era of AI. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this conversation, your favorite takeaways, and how you're using AI to drive innovation at your institution. Let's keep the conversation going on LinkedIn. I'm Dave Hunt. We'll catch you next time.
The Higher Ed Pulse is part of the Enrollify podcast network. If you like this podcast, chances are you'll like other Enrollify shows too. Our podcast network is growing by the month, and we've got a plethora of marketing, enrollment, and higher ed technology shows that are jam-packed with stories, ideas, and frameworks, all designed to empower you to be a better higher ed professional. Our show helps higher ed marketers and admission pros find their next big idea and features a selection of the industry's best as your hosts. Learn from Brian Gross, Eddie Francis, Jenny Lee Fowler, and so many of your favorite leaders in higher ed. Enrollify is made possible by Element 451, the next generation AI student engagement platform, helping institutions create meaningful and personalized interactions with students. Learn more at element451.com.